"She got in on luck," he said, loud enough that I could hear it from across the room. A few people nearby turned their heads. Some smiled. Nobody corrected him. He was standing near the front of the press briefing area with two of his communications directors, holding a coffee cup and wearing the particular expression of a man who has never had to lower his voice in a professional setting because no one has ever asked him to. I was standing at the back of the room, near the door, in the spot I had occupied every day for 4 years of university, the last seat on the left, the one nobody wanted, the one closest to the draft from the hallway and farthest from the projector screen. I had learned to read from that seat. I had learned to see from that seat. And now, standing in the anteroom of a federal oversight hearing, about to walk into the room where everything Marcus Webb had built was about to be examined, I thought about that seat, and I thought about how thoroughly he had always misunderstood what it meant to sit there. My name is Claire Okafor. At the time of these events, I was 37 years old and a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force, serving as a senior aviation accident investigator with federal certification in aerospace systems failure analysis. Most people who encountered me in professional settings saw a woman who was careful with words, precise with conclusions, and unusually patient with silence. They did not see the 12 years of accident reconstruction work behind that patience. They did not see the hundreds of flight data recorders I had reviewed, the thousands of pages of maintenance logs I had read, the dozens of formal hearings where I had sat at the witness table and answered questions from people who had spent weeks preparing to challenge findings I had spent months producing. They saw someone quiet. They assumed quiet meant uncertain. That assumption was one of the most consistently expensive mistakes people made around me. To understand the hearing, you need to understand the history. And to understand the history, you need to go back further than the accident, further than Marcus Webb's airline, further than my career. You need to go back to a university lecture hall in Michigan, to a room full of aerospace engineering students in their second year, and to the particular social architecture of that room, which was, like most social architectures I had encountered, arranged by confidence rather than competence. I grew up in Cleveland, the daughter of a Nigerian-born mechanical engineer and an American schoolteacher who had met at a conference and built a life together with the same methodical attention they applied to everything else. My father believed in precision. My mother believed in showing your work. Between them, they produced a child who was allergic to approximation and genuinely distressed by incomplete information. This was not always socially convenient. It was, however, professionally invaluable. I was not the kind of student who dominated classrooms. I was the kind who listened until I had something specific to say, and then said it once, completely, without repetition. My professors either loved this or found it unnerving, depending on whether they were more interested in enthusiasm or accuracy. My classmates mostly found it strange. In a program full of young people performing their own intelligence for each other, I was the one in the back who did not seem to need an audience. Marcus Webb was in that program. He was 2 years ahead of me, already a minor legend by the time I arrived. His father owned a regional cargo airline. He had his private pilot license before he could legally drink. He was handsome in a way that photographed well, which mattered more than it should have in a department that was beginning to court corporate partnerships. He knew everyone. Everyone knew him. He spoke in seminars with the ease of someone who had never considered the possibility of being wrong out loud. He noticed me exactly once during those years. It was during a departmental mixer in the spring of my second year. He was holding court near the refreshment table with a group of students who would later form the inner circle of his professional network, the people who would sit on his board, work in his executive team, attend his wedding, and, much later, stand in the lobby of a federal building trying to contain a catastrophe. I was near the edge of the room, talking to a professor whose research I found genuinely interesting, when Marcus glanced over, assessed the scene with the quick social calculus of someone always tracking room dynamics, and said to the person beside him, "She got in on luck." I heard it. The professor heard it. Neither of us acknowledged it. I filed it in the category of information that was not yet relevant and went back to the conversation about aerodynamic flutter modeling, which was considerably more interesting than Marcus Webb's opinion of my admissions file. I graduated. I commissioned. I entered the Air Force investigation pipeline, which was long and demanding and exactly right for the specific shape of my brain. The work required the ability to hold enormous amounts of technical detail in suspension while simultaneously constructing a coherent causal narrative, to follow evidence without being seduced by the most obvious explanation, and to remain functional under the institutional pressure that always attended investigations into accidents that had killed people and disrupted industries. I was good at it. Not because I was the most technically gifted person in every room, though I was more technically gifted than most people assumed, but because I genuinely could not leave an incomplete picture alone. Every discrepancy was a thread. Every thread led somewhere. I followed them all. Marcus, meanwhile, had built an airline. His father's cargo operation had been the foundation, but Marcus had expanded it aggressively into regional passenger service during a period when the market rewarded speed over caution. He had acquired gates, routes, and smaller carriers with the enthusiasm of someone who had been told since birth that he had good instincts and had never seriously tested that belief against evidence. Webb Regional Air grew quickly. It was profitable for several years. It attracted investors who liked the growth story and did not ask too many questions about the maintenance culture. I was aware of the company the way you are aware of things in your professional periphery. It operated in airspace I sometimes had reason to review. Its incident reports passed through databases I monitored, nothing alarming. Nothing that would have triggered a formal inquiry, small irregularities, the kind that every carrier produces, the kind that can mean nothing or can mean everything depending on what they are symptoms of. I noticed them, I noted them, I moved on to other work, then came the incident outside of Cincinnati. A Webb Regional turboprop experienced a partial power loss on approach during an evening flight carrying 31 passengers and 3 crew members. The crew handled it well. Nobody was seriously injured. The aircraft landed safely on a secondary runway with emergency services standing by. In the official language of aviation safety, it was classified as a serious incident rather than an accident, a distinction that matters bureaucratically but not morally. 34 people had been closer to a different outcome than any of them knew. I was assigned as lead investigator. The early phase of any investigation involves what we call evidence preservation and hypothesis generation. You secure the physical evidence, collect the data, interview the crew, and then you generate every plausible explanation for what happened before you begin eliminating them. The hypothesis generation phase is important precisely because it requires you to suspend judgment. You cannot follow evidence honestly if you have already decided what it should show. The physical evidence in this case was straightforward. The maintenance records were less so. Over the following weeks, as my team worked through the documentation, a pattern emerged that I had seen before in a different context, not in aviation, but in a federal procurement investigation I had supported during a secondment to a joint oversight unit several years earlier. The pattern was one of systematic compression. Maintenance intervals that were technically within regulatory tolerance individually, but that, when examined collectively against the actual operational tempo of the fleet, revealed a maintenance culture that was managing to the boundary of the permissible rather than to the standard of the safe. The records showed work completed. They did not show work done well. There is a difference, and the difference lives in the details that experienced investigators know to look for in the margins of forms, in the revision histories of documents, in the small timestamp inconsistencies that accumulate when people are recording what they wish had happened rather than what did. I documented everything. Every discrepancy was logged, dated, cross-referenced. I built a timeline that stretched back not weeks, but years, covering the period during which the maintenance cost reduction program had been implemented, which coincided with the period during which Web Regional's investor presentations had highlighted operational efficiency improvements. The efficiency improvements and the maintenance irregularities were not unrelated. That was the finding I was preparing to present. 3 weeks before the formal hearing, Marcus Webb requested a meeting. He came with 2 attorneys and a communications director named Fletcher, whom I recognized from an earlier press interaction. We met in a conference room at the investigation office. Marcus had aged well, the way men with money usually do. He was confident, professionally warm, and arrived with the bearing of someone who expected to be useful to me in the resolution of a regrettable situation. He expressed concern about the direction of the investigation. He said the findings as he understood them were being shaped by a reading of the records that did not account for industry standard practices. He said he had engaged 3 independent experts who had reviewed the same records and reached different conclusions. He placed their reports on the table. He said he hoped we could align on a framing that was fair to his airline and his employees. He looked at me with the particular expression of a man who has found that most problems yield to the application of patient, well-funded persuasion. I listened to all of it. Then I said, I have read your experts' reports. I noted the sections where they disagreed with my team's analysis. I will address each point in the formal findings document. I thanked him for his time. I stood up. The meeting was over. Fletcher, the communications director, caught up with me in the hallway outside. He said, "The colonel, he thinks you might have a perspective issue here." I stopped walking. I turned around. I said, "I am sorry?" Fletcher said, "He just means, given your background, the way you came up, he wonders if there is a tendency to look for problems that confirm a particular narrative." I looked at Fletcher for a long moment. I thought about the last seat. I thought about the mixer. I thought about every room I had ever been in where someone had explained my limitations to me with the patient confidence of someone describing geography to a tourist. I said, "Tell Mr. Webb I will see him at the hearing." I walked away. The hearing was held in a federal building in Washington. The room was larger than I had expected, filled with aviation industry representatives, congressional staffers, insurance company observers, and journalists who covered transportation safety. Marcus arrived with a legal team of 4 and a communication staff of 3. He sat at the respondent table with the composed expression of a man who had prepared thoroughly and believed his preparation was sufficient. I arrived with my investigation file and my deputy, a captain named Rodriguez, who had been with me for 3 years and who had the specific quality I valued most in a colleague. She never told me what I wanted to hear. She told me what the evidence showed. The hearing opened with standard procedural matters. Then the chair invited me to present the investigation findings. I stood. I had presented findings at dozens of hearings over the course of my career. I had learned that the way you begin sets the temperature of everything that follows. I did not begin with the conclusion. I began with the aircraft. For 40 minutes, I walked the room through the incident itself, the timeline of the flight, the crew's response, the physical evidence from the engine, the data recorder information. I was thorough and specific, and I did not hurry. When people are about to hear something they do not want to hear, the quality of the path you build toward it determines whether they can follow you to the end. Then I moved to the maintenance records. The first document I introduced was a comparative analysis of maintenance interval records against operational tempo data for the previous 3 years. I had had it displayed on the room's presentation screen, and I walked through it section by section. The pattern was visible. I did not need to characterize it. I simply described what the numbers showed and let the room understand what description meant. Marcus's lead attorney objected twice during this section. Both objections were procedurally noted and did not interrupt the presentation. The second document was the revision history analysis. This required more explanation because it was more technical and because its significance depended on understanding how aviation maintenance documentation systems record changes. I had prepared for this. I explained the system. I explained what normal revision patterns look like. I explained what the revision patterns in these records looked like and why they were different. The room was very quiet during this portion. Marcus was writing notes on a legal pad. His expression was controlled. Fletcher, sitting in the row behind him, was looking at his phone. Then I introduced the third document. It was not part of my original investigation file. It had come to me 6 weeks earlier through a source I am not able to name in this account and am not required to name in any formal proceeding because the document itself was a public record. It was a maintenance audit commissioned internally by Webb Regional 2 years prior, conducted by a firm that had since been dissolved. The audit had found many of the same irregularities my team had found. Its conclusions had recommended corrective actions. Those recommendations were documented in an appendix. They had not been implemented. The audit had been filed, and then it had been left where it was, which was precisely far enough from the public record that no external investigator had ever thought to look for it. I had thought to look for it. The room changed when I put it on the screen. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way pressure changes before weather arrives, something in the atmosphere of the room shifted. I saw Marcus stop writing. I saw his lead attorney turn to the second attorney and say something. I saw Fletcher put down his phone. I said, "This document indicates that the maintenance irregularities identified in my investigation were known to Webb Regional leadership at least 24 months prior to the Cincinnati incident." I paused. I said, "The corrective actions recommended in this internal audit were not implemented." I paused again. I said, "I will now enter this document into the formal record." Marcus stood up. The chair asked him to wait for the open comment period. He sat down. His face was not pale. It was something else. It was the face of a man recalculating distances, realizing that where he thought he was standing and where he was actually standing were two different places. His lead attorney requested a recess. The chair granted 15 minutes. During the recess, I stood near the window at the side of the room with Rodriguez. She handed me a coffee. She said, "The internal audit was the one they were not expecting." I said, "I know." She said, "Where did you find it?" I said, "I looked in the places people forget to look when they are filing things they hope nobody finds." She nodded. She understood. That was the work. That had always been the work. When the hearing resumed, Marcus's lead attorney made a prepared statement. He said that his client had been operating in good faith within a regulatory environment that had its own systemic challenges. He said that the internal audit had been commissioned as part of a continuous improvement process and that its recommendations had been under consideration at the time of the incident. He said that his client welcomed a collaborative framework for addressing the findings. He said several other things that were professionally constructed and factually incomplete. When he finished, the chair turned to me for response. I said that I had one additional item to address. I introduced a fourth document. It was a series of emails between Marcus Webb and his chief of operations, recovered from corporate records during the discovery process, covering the period after the internal audit had been completed and before the Cincinnati incident. The emails discussed the audit recommendations. They discussed the cost of implementation. They discussed, in the particular shorthand of people who believe their internal communications are private, the decision to defer the recommended work until after the next investor review period, which was 6 months out. The Cincinnati incident had occurred 4 months after that email chain ended. Marcus was very still. I did not look at him while I presented this section. I looked at the room. I looked at the faces of the industry representatives, who were people I had dealt with professionally for years. I looked at the congressional staffers, who were taking notes at a pace that had increased noticeably. I looked at the journalists in the back row who had stopped moving entirely. I said, my findings are that the Cincinnati incident was the result of a maintenance failure that was predictable, that was predicted, and that was deferred for reasons unrelated to aviation safety. I said that my recommendations included a comprehensive audit of the Webb regional fleet, a formal review of the company's maintenance culture and documentation practices, and referral of the email evidence to the appropriate federal authority for review of potential regulatory violations. I said that I would submit the complete findings document within the required time frame. I said that I had nothing further to add. I sat down. The room was quiet for several seconds. Then it was not quiet at all. Marcus did not speak during the open comment period. His attorney spoke. His communications director spoke. Various industry representatives spoke. I answered questions from the chair and from 2 committee members with the same specific, document-referenced precision I had used throughout the presentation. At no point did I characterize Marcus Webb as a person. At no point did I use language that went beyond what the evidence showed. I did not need to. The evidence was doing its own work, quietly, thoroughly, the way evidence does when someone has taken the time to gather all of it, instead of stopping at the most convenient conclusion. The hearing ended in the early afternoon. In the lobby afterward, I was gathering my materials when I heard Marcus's voice behind me. It was quieter than it had been in any of the professional settings I had encountered him in over the years. He said, "Claire." I turned. His attorneys were standing a few steps back. Fletcher was near the door with his phone pressed to his ear. Marcus looked at me without the social performance that usually accompanied his public face. He looked tired in the specific way that people look when they have been carrying something heavy and the weight has finally been acknowledged. He said, "I did not know you would be the investigator." I said that would not have changed the findings. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I said something about you once, a long time ago. I do not know if you heard it." I looked at him. I said nothing. He said, "I was wrong, about a lot of things." He glanced down at the folder I was holding. "About you, specifically." I held his gaze. I said, The seat at the back of the room sees the whole room. He did not answer. I do not think he fully understood what I meant. That was all right. Understanding it was never the point. Living it was. I left the building. The afternoon air was cool and flat, the kind of weather that holds no particular promise in any direction. Rodriguez was waiting near the car. She had brought a second coffee. I took it. We stood there for a moment without saying anything. That was one of the things I valued most about working with her. She understood that not every important moment needed to be described while it was happening. In the months that followed, the formal investigation findings were published. Webb Regional underwent the mandated fleet audit. Several additional maintenance irregularities were identified. The email evidence was reviewed by the appropriate federal authority. I was not a party to whatever followed from that review, and I did not seek to be. My work ended where the formal record began. That was the boundary of my role, and I respected it the way I respected all the boundaries that gave structure to difficult work. Webb Regional suspended operations for 60 days during the remediation period. When it resumed, it did so with a new chief of operations, a new maintenance oversight structure, and a new documentation system that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of systematic compression my investigation had identified. Marcus Webb remained as chief executive for another 8 months before stepping down to pursue what the press release called other opportunities. I read about it in a transportation industry newsletter on a Tuesday morning while eating breakfast and thought about it for approximately 45 seconds before moving on to the next item. I think about the Cincinnati crew sometimes. I think about the captain who had done everything right in a situation that should never have been created for her. I think about the 31 passengers who landed safely and went home to their families and probably did not think in the hours and days that followed about the chain of deferred decisions that had put them closer to a different outcome than they ever knew. I think about what it means to find those chains before they reach the end of their length. That is what the work is. That is what it has always been. People sometimes ask me whether it felt like justice, the hearing, the findings, the eventual consequences for the airline. I tell them I do not think about it in those terms. Justice is a category that belongs to the people who were affected by what happened. My category is accuracy. My responsibility is to find out what occurred and why, to document it completely, and to present it clearly enough that the people with the authority to act have everything they need to act well. What they do with it is theirs. What I do with the evidence is mine. But I will say this. There is a particular satisfaction, quiet and private and not performative, that comes from standing in a room where someone has spent years assuming they know the limits of your capability and simply opening a folder, not with drama, not with announcement, just opening it and letting what is inside speak for itself. That satisfaction is not about them. It is not about proving anything to anyone. It is about knowing that the years you spent in the last seat, reading carefully, watching the whole room, following every thread to its conclusion, those years were not invisible. They were building something. And when the moment came that required everything they had built, it was ready. My father used to say that precision is kindness. What he meant was that imprecision costs people things, money, safety, time, sometimes their lives, and that the discipline to be exact, to measure twice, to follow the decimal point to the end, was not pedantry. It was care, the most honest form of care. I have tried to carry that forward in every room I have worked in, including the ones where I sat at the back, including the ones where someone across the room decided I was there on luck. Luck had nothing to do with it. It never does, for anyone who has done the work. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this story touched something in your experience, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. And if you are drawn to stories about precision, patience, and the long game strength of people who were never who others assumed they were, please subscribe. The next journey is already waiting.